The worst mistake I ever made was giving someone access to my money when what I was really giving them was my trust. I wish I could say I saw the warning signs from the beginning. I wish I could tell you there was a moment when something felt wrong and I listened to that feeling. But the truth is much harder to admit. I trusted her completely. My name is Evelyn Parker. I am 68 years old, and for 44 years, my husband Robert handled almost every financial detail in our household. He paid the bills, balanced the accounts, managed investments, and kept careful records in a file cabinet that sat beside his desk. I never worried about any of it because I never had to. Robert was organized, patient, and dependable. Then, 18 months ago, he passed away after a brief illness. And suddenly, I found myself sitting alone at a kitchen table covered with bank statements, insurance forms, passwords, and documents I barely understood. Every envelope that arrived in the mail felt overwhelming. Every phone call from a financial institution made my stomach tighten. I was grieving, exhausted, and afraid of making mistakes. That was when my daughter-in-law Lisa stepped in. At first, her help felt like a blessing. She called regularly to check on me. She offered to organize paperwork. She sat beside me at the dining room table and explained things in a calm, reassuring voice. When I became confused by online banking screens and account notifications, she patiently walked me through them. I remember feeling grateful that my son had married someone so thoughtful. One Saturday afternoon, Lisa came over carrying coffee and a notebook. We spent nearly 3 hours reviewing bills and account information. She created lists, labeled folders, and simplified things that seemed impossibly complicated to me. By the end of the afternoon, I felt relief for the first time in months. As she gathered her things to leave, she paused and looked at me. "You do not have to do all of this alone, Evelyn," she said. "If you want, I can help manage some of it until everything feels easier." Those words sounded kind, loving even. Looking back, I understand why I said yes so quickly. Grief has a way of making you reach for any hand offered to you. Over the next few weeks, I began sharing more information than I ever imagined I would. Account numbers, login credentials, passwords, access to statements. Every time I hesitated, Lisa reassured me that everything would remain transparent and organized. My son Mark encouraged it as well. "Lisa is great with finances, Mom," he said. "She is only trying to help." And honestly, I believed him. For a while, everything seemed better. Bills were paid on time. Statements were easier to understand. The constant stress that had followed me since Robert's passing finally began to ease. I started sleeping through the night again. I stopped worrying every time the mail arrived. Most importantly, I felt less alone. That was what made the decision so dangerous. It did not feel reckless. It felt reasonable. It felt responsible. It felt like family taking care of family. On a quiet Tuesday evening, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open in front of me, I handed Lisa the final password she needed. I remember smiling as I wrote it down. At the time, it felt like the end of a difficult chapter. I had no idea it was actually the beginning of one. For the next several months, everything appeared to work exactly as Lisa promised it would. The stack of unopened envelopes on my kitchen counter disappeared. Bills were paid automatically. Account balances seemed stable. Whenever I had a question, Lisa always had an answer ready. If I received a confusing letter from the bank, she explained it. If a statement arrived with unfamiliar terminology, she translated it into plain English. More than once, I told friends how fortunate I was to have a daughter-in-law willing to help. Looking back now, I realized that trust grows most easily when nothing appears wrong. The first change was so small, I barely noticed it. One afternoon, I was waiting for a monthly account statement that always arrived during the second week of the month. By the end of the week, it still had not come. When I mentioned it to Lisa, she smiled and told me many banks were encouraging customers to switch to electronic delivery. "It is more secure," she said, "and it keeps important information from getting lost in the mail." That sounded reasonable. A few days later, she told me she had updated several notification settings to make things easier. I thanked her. At the time, I genuinely believed she was helping. Then there were the little decisions that gradually stopped involving me. A credit card was replaced because of an alleged security concern. A savings account was reorganized for efficiency. Several automatic payments were adjusted. Every explanation sounded logical. Every change sounded responsible. Whenever I hesitated, Lisa patiently walked me through the details. Mark always supported her. "Lisa knows what she is doing, Mom," he would say. You should not have to stress about this stuff anymore. The strange thing was that I did feel less stress. That was what made everything so difficult to recognize. Most people expect betrayal to arrive dramatically. They imagine arguments, obvious lies, or suspicious behavior. Real life is often much quieter. Sometimes trust erodes one small decision at a time. One morning, I logged into an account because I wanted to review a charitable donation I had made earlier that year. The screen looked different. Several settings had changed. New contact information appeared in places I did not remember seeing before. When I asked Lisa about it, she explained that the financial institution had updated its online platform. She sounded so confident that I immediately accepted the explanation. A few weeks later, I noticed fewer notifications arriving on my phone. Again, Lisa had an answer. She explained that excessive alerts often confused customers and that she had simplified everything. You do not need 10 messages every time something happens, she laughed. I laughed too. It seemed harmless. Yet as the months passed, something subtle began changing. I found myself asking permission to understand my own finances. Not intentionally, not consciously, but whenever a question arose, I waited for Lisa to explain it instead of finding the answer myself. She became the bridge between me and information that once belonged directly to me. I did not realize it then, but a dangerous shift was taking place. I still owned the accounts. My name was still on the paperwork. Yet little by little, I was becoming a guest in decisions that affected my own future. And the most troubling part was that I remained grateful for it. Because at that moment, I still believed the person helping me was also the person protecting me. 8 months passed before the first real crack appeared. By then, the new arrangement had become normal. Lisa handled most financial questions before I even knew they existed. Mark rarely discussed money with me anymore because he assumed everything was already being managed. Even I had stopped checking certain details. Looking back, that was probably the most dangerous part of all. Trust had become routine. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I returned home from lunch with a friend and found a large envelope sitting inside my mailbox. At first, nothing about it seemed unusual. The return address belonged to a financial institution I recognized immediately. The envelope was thicker than most account statements, and across the front was a notice requesting prompt attention. I carried it into the kitchen, set it beside a cup of tea, and opened it without much thought. The moment I started reading, something felt wrong. The document referred to account management updates and authorized communication preferences. Several names appeared throughout the paperwork. I expected to see mine. Instead, I noticed Lisa's name appearing repeatedly in places where I did not expect it. At first, I assumed I was misunderstanding the language. Financial documents often contain confusing terminology. I read the pages again, then a third time. My tea sat untouched as I studied every line. The more carefully I read, the more uneasy I became. Certain notifications were being directed elsewhere. Certain communications no longer appeared to come directly to me. Most concerning of all, I realized there were changes I did not remember approving. My heart began beating faster. Even then, I was not ready to suspect Lisa. I immediately searched for innocent explanations. Maybe paperwork had been processed incorrectly. Maybe I had signed something months earlier and forgotten. Grief can cloud memory. Age can make people doubt themselves. I told myself there had to be a simple answer. Still, the feeling refused to leave. I picked up the phone and called Lisa. She answered cheerfully as always. When I mentioned the envelope, there was a brief pause before she responded. It lasted only a second, but I noticed it. Then her confident tone returned. She explained that several institutions periodically updated account administration records. According to her, the paperwork was routine and nothing required my attention. You do not need to worry about any of that, Evelyn, she said warmly. I already handled it months ago. Normally, those words would have reassured me. This time they did not. After we ended the call, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the documents. The phrase kept repeating in my mind. I already handled it months ago. The more I thought about it, the stranger it sounded. How could something involving my accounts have been handled without my memory of it? Why had I not received information sooner? Why was I learning about it through a mailed notice that appeared to arrive by mistake? That evening, I placed the envelope inside a drawer rather than throwing it away. Something inside me had changed. Not dramatically, not enough to start an argument, but enough to make me pay attention. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt a quiet sense of concern I could not explain. The trust one had given so freely was still there, but a small question had begun growing beside it. And once that question appeared, I could not make it disappear. The envelope stayed in my drawer for nearly a week. During that time, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Every morning, I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Every evening, I found myself thinking about the same questions again. The problem was not what I knew. The problem was what I did not know. Eventually, curiosity became stronger than discomfort. The following Tuesday, I decided to visit the local branch of the financial institution listed on the paperwork. I did not tell Lisa. I did not tell Mark. I simply drove across town after breakfast and walked into the building carrying the envelope in my purse. The branch looked exactly as I remembered. Quiet music played in the background. A few customers sat waiting for appointments. After checking in at the front desk, I was directed to a customer service representative named Karen. She appeared to be in her early 50s and greeted me with a warm smile. I explained that I had received a document I did not fully understand and asked if she could help clarify a few details. Karen reviewed the paperwork carefully. At first, her expression remained neutral. Then something changed. It was subtle. A slight pause. A second look at one particular page. She quickly regained her professional composure, but I noticed it. Years of raising children had taught me to recognize when someone was choosing their words carefully. "Mrs. Parker," she said gently, "can you confirm whether you personally requested these communication changes?" I felt a small knot tighten in my stomach. "I do not remember doing so," I replied honestly. Karen nodded and continued reviewing the file. Some of these updates were processed several months ago. Her tone remained professional, but the concern in her eyes was becoming harder to ignore. I asked if there was a problem. Karen hesitated. "I cannot discuss certain account details without following proper procedures," she explained. "However, I would recommend that you personally review all account authorizations and contact preferences associated with your records." The wording was careful, but the message was clear. Something deserved closer attention. Before leaving, I requested copies of every document I was legally entitled to review. Karen helped me complete the necessary forms. When I returned home that afternoon, I spread the paperwork across my dining room table. For the next 3 hours, I examined every page. Dates, signatures, contact information, authorization records. Most of it seemed ordinary. Then I found something that made my heart stop. One form contained updated communication instructions connected to several important accounts. My eyes moved slowly across the page. Primary contact information, notification preferences, administrative communication routing. Certain sections now directed correspondence somewhere other than my home address. I read the document again. Then again. The signature field contained my name. Yet I had no memory of signing that particular form. None at all. I stared at the page for a long time. Outside, the afternoon sun slowly moved across the backyard. Inside, a feeling I had been avoiding finally settled into place. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was no longer a forgotten detail or a simple administrative adjustment. For the first time since Robert died, I began to wonder whether the person I trusted most with my financial affairs had been making decisions I was never meant to notice. And once that thought entered my mind, I knew there was no turning back. That evening, I pulled Robert's old file cabinet away from the wall and unlocked the bottom drawer. For years, he had kept copies of everything. Tax returns, account summaries, insurance records, investment statements. If there was one thing my husband believed, it was that paper trails mattered. As I sorted through the folders, I felt as though I were having a conversation with him again. Every label was written in the same neat handwriting I knew by heart. Every document reflected the careful attention he brought to every part of our life together. Around 9 o'clock, I carried several folders to the dining room table and began comparing old records with the documents I had received from the financial institution. At first, the differences seemed small. An updated mailing preference here. A revised contact method there. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would alarm someone reviewing a single page. But when I started placing the documents side by side, a pattern emerged. One change led to another, then another. Over the course of several months, information that once came directly to me had slowly been redirected elsewhere. Notifications, alerts, administrative correspondence. None of these changes transferred ownership of anything. Yet together they created something troubling. They reduced my visibility into decisions involving my own accounts. The realization left me staring silently at the paperwork. This had not happened overnight. It had happened gradually, carefully, deliberately. The next morning, I called the financial institution again and requested additional historical records. The representative explained that retrieving older account administration changes might take a few days. I thanked her and waited. Those days felt longer than they should have. Meanwhile, I behaved exactly as I always had. When Lisa called, I answered cheerfully. When Mark invited me to dinner, I accepted. I asked no questions and mentioned none of my concerns. Part of me still hoped there was an explanation I had not considered. Part of me wanted to believe I was misunderstanding everything. Then the records arrived. I spread them across the dining room table and spent nearly 4 hours reviewing them. By the time I finished, my hands felt cold. Several changes had been submitted during periods when I clearly remembered not being involved. Communication preferences had been adjusted multiple times. Contact information had been updated. Certain notifications had been reduced or rerouted. Individually, each action could be justified. Together, they created a very different picture. The most disturbing discovery was not a transaction. It was a timeline. Once I arranged the records by date, I noticed that almost every significant change occurred after I had given Lisa access to help manage my accounts. Before that point, everything flowed directly through me. After that point, the flow of information gradually shifted. I sat quietly for several minutes, looking at the pages spread before me. Outside, children were riding bicycles down the street. A lawn mower hummed somewhere in the neighborhood. Ordinary life continued as though nothing had changed. Yet inside my house, a truth was slowly taking shape. This was never about convenience. It was never about simplifying my life. Someone had been creating distance between me and my own financial information. Later that evening, my granddaughter Olivia stopped by unexpectedly to return a baking dish. We talked for a few minutes in the kitchen. As she prepared to leave, she hesitated near the door. "Grandma," she said carefully, "can I ask you something?" I smiled. "Of course." Olivia looked uncomfortable. "Why does Mom always say you do not like dealing with money anymore?" The question hit me harder than I expected. Because for the first time, I realized this story might have been told to more people than just me. Olivia's question stayed with me long after she left. I stood at the kitchen window watching her walk down the driveway toward her car, and for the first time, I felt something deeper than confusion. I felt concern, not just about my finances, but about the story being told around them. Why would Lisa tell people that I no longer wanted to deal with money? I had certainly felt overwhelmed after Robert died, but overwhelmed was not the same thing as incapable. There was a difference between accepting help and surrendering responsibility. The next morning, I decided to stop focusing only on paperwork and start paying attention to intentions. I returned to the dining room table, spread out the records again, and reviewed the timeline I had assembled. The dates revealed more than account changes. They revealed a gradual shift in authority. First came assistance, then convenience, then fewer notifications, then redirected communications, then assumptions that Lisa would handle things on my behalf. Every step seemed reasonable when viewed alone. Together, they looked very different. Around noon, I called an attorney named David Reynolds. David had worked with Robert on estate planning years earlier. I had not spoken with him since my husband's funeral, but he immediately remembered me. We scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon. Walking into his office felt strangely familiar. The scent of coffee, polished wood, and old legal books reminded me of meetings Robert and I attended together years ago. David listened carefully as I explained everything. The passwords, the communication changes, the redirected notifications, the forms I did not remember signing. He asked thoughtful questions and took notes without interrupting. When I finished, he sat quietly for several moments. Then he said something that changed the way I viewed the entire situation. "Evelyn, what concerns me most is not what was changed. It is the pattern behind the changes." I immediately knew what he meant. For weeks, I had been looking at individual actions. David was looking at the larger picture. He explained that financial control rarely shifts through one dramatic event. More often, it changes through a series of small decisions that gradually reduce a person's direct involvement. The more he spoke, the more uncomfortable I became, because every description sounded familiar. Then David asked a question I had not considered. "Has anyone been encouraging the idea that you no longer want to manage your own affairs?" Olivia's words echoed instantly in my mind. I told him what she had said. David nodded slowly. That matters, he said. Because if enough people start believing a narrative, eventually they stop questioning it. I drove home feeling unsettled. Not because David had confirmed wrongdoing. He had not. In fact, he was very careful not to jump to conclusions. What unsettled me was something else. For the first time, I realized the goal may never have been a few transactions or account settings. The goal may have been perception. If people believed I no longer wanted involvement, then every future decision would seem reasonable. Every transfer of responsibility would appear natural. Every loss of control would look voluntary. That evening, I sat in Robert's study and stared at a framed photograph of the two of us taken on our 40th anniversary. He had always believed that intentions mattered more than explanations. Anyone could explain a decision after it happened. Intentions revealed why it happened in the first place. And as I looked at everything I had uncovered, a troubling realization finally settled into place. Lisa was not trying to take a few responsibilities off my shoulders. She was quietly preparing a future where my voice no longer mattered. After meeting with David Reynolds, I made a decision that surprised even me. I would say nothing, at least not yet. For weeks, I had imagined confronting Lisa with the documents spread across my dining room table. I imagined asking direct questions and demanding explanations. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that confrontation would only accomplish one thing. It would give her time to adjust her story. David agreed. If you want to understand what is really happening, he told me, pay attention to what people do when they believe you know nothing. So that became my plan. I continued living exactly as I had before. When Lisa called, I thanked her for her help. When Mark asked whether everything was going smoothly, I assured him it was. At family dinners, I smiled, listened, and acted like the grateful mother everyone expected me to be. The strange part was how easy it became. Once I stopped looking for explanations and started observing behavior, I began noticing things I had overlooked for months. Lisa seemed increasingly confident. She spoke about my finances as though they were already partly her responsibility. She often answered questions directed at me before I could respond myself. During one Sunday lunch, a relative asked whether I planned to make changes to my investment accounts. Before I could speak, Lisa smiled and said, "We are still reviewing the best options." The word immediately caught my attention. Nobody else appeared to notice. A few days later, I received another call from Olivia. We talked about school, college applications, and her summer plans. Then, almost casually, she mentioned something that made me sit upright in my chair. "Mom says you probably will not want to manage everything much longer," Olivia said. "She thinks you deserve less stress." I remained silent for a moment. "Does she say that often?" I asked. Olivia hesitated. "Kind of. She talks like it is already decided." After we ended the call, I sat alone in my living room staring at nothing. There it was again. The same narrative. The same assumption. Not that I wanted help. Not that I needed support. But that eventually I would step aside completely. That evening, I reviewed every document one more time. Then I organized everything into a binder. Timelines, account records, communication changes, copies of forms, notes from my meeting with David. The more organized the information became, the clearer the picture looked. This was never about a few administrative updates. It was about influence, control, perception. Lisa was not trying to take ownership of my money. She was creating a situation where everyone would eventually believe she should be the one making decisions. And the most troubling part was that the process appeared to be working. Mark trusted her completely. Other relatives seemed to accept her version of events. Even I had accepted it for a long time. The following week, Lisa called with an unusual suggestion. She wanted to host a family meeting to discuss future planning. According to her, it would help everyone stay informed and organized. As she spoke, I felt a calmness settle over me. For months, I had been following clues. Now, for the first time, it felt as though the story was finally approaching its conclusion. I agreed immediately. Lisa sounded pleased, almost relieved. When the call ended, I picked up my phone and called David. Then I opened the binder resting on my dining room table. Because if Lisa believed she was walking into a meeting where everyone would support her plans, she was about to discover how much I had learned while pretending to know nothing at all. 8 days later, the family meeting took place at Mark and Lisa's house on a quiet Saturday afternoon. When I arrived, everything appeared perfectly normal. Fresh coffee sat on the kitchen counter. Plates of snacks were arranged neatly on the dining table. Family photographs lined the walls, capturing birthdays, graduations, and holiday gatherings from years gone by. If someone had walked into the room without context, they would have assumed this was simply another family discussion about future plans. Lisa greeted me warmly and invited me to sit near the center of the table. Mark seemed relaxed. Olivia sat quietly near the window. Several close relatives had been invited as well. The atmosphere felt comfortable and welcoming. That was exactly what made the next hour so revealing. Once everyone settled into their seats, Lisa stood and thanked everyone for coming. She explained that families worked best when responsibilities were clearly organized and everyone understood future expectations. Several people nodded. Then she turned toward me with a reassuring smile. "We all want what is best for Evelyn," she said. "The last couple of years have been difficult, and we want to make sure she has less stress moving forward." Her voice sounded thoughtful and caring, yet something immediately felt familiar. She was speaking about me rather than to me. As the discussion continued, Lisa described various ways family members could help manage future responsibilities. She spoke about organization, efficiency, and reducing unnecessary burdens. Then the conversation shifted toward finances. Honestly, Evelyn has not wanted to deal with most of these financial details for quite a while now, Lisa said confidently. Several relatives glanced toward me. Before I could respond, she continued, "The reality is that Mark and I have already been handling many of these responsibilities. At some point, it simply makes sense to formalize what is already happening." The room remained quiet. Lisa smiled gently as she looked around the table. "We all want Evelyn to feel comfortable," she added. "She should be enjoying her retirement, not worrying about decisions that have become difficult for her." For a moment, nobody spoke. I noticed a few family members nodding politely. Mark appeared comfortable with everything being said. It was clear they had heard some version of this story before. I folded my hands calmly in front of me. Then I smiled. "Before we go any further," I said, "there is someone I would like everyone to hear from." Confusion appeared across several faces. A few moments later, the front door opened and David Reynolds stepped inside carrying a slim leather folder. The room immediately fell silent. Lisa's expression changed. Mark looked surprised. David greeted everyone politely before taking a seat beside me. Then, in a calm and professional voice, he began reviewing a documented timeline of account changes. He explained how communications had gradually been redirected. Notifications had been reduced. Contact preferences had been modified. Administrative information that once came directly to me had slowly been routed elsewhere. Every statement was supported by records. Every date matched documents contained in the binder resting on the table beside me. No accusations were necessary because the paperwork spoke clearly on its own. As David continued, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. Family members who had been nodding along moments earlier now sat quietly reviewing copies of the records placed before them. Mark's expression shifted from confidence to disbelief. Olivia stared at the pages without saying a word. Lisa attempted to explain several changes as efforts to help me, but for the first time, nobody accepted the explanations automatically. The issue was no longer one document or one decision. It was the pattern. For the first time that afternoon, nobody was looking at me. They were looking at Lisa, not because of one form, not because of one update, but because every page pointed in the same direction. More control, less visibility, less involvement from me. And as everyone studied the timeline spread across the table, the story Lisa had spent months building finally collided with something much stronger than assumptions. It collided with the truth. The room remained silent long after David finished speaking. No one rushed to argue with the documents spread across the table. No one challenged the timeline. The records had done something that months of conversations never could. They removed assumptions and replaced them with facts. Lisa sat motionless, her hands folded tightly in front of her. The confidence she had carried into the meeting seemed to disappear with every page that family members reviewed. Mark looked from the documents to me and back again, as though he were struggling to understand how he had missed so much. For several long moments, nobody spoke. Then Mark finally broke the silence. "Mom," he said quietly, "why did you not tell me any of this sooner?" I looked at my son and felt a sadness deeper than anger. Because even now, he did not fully understand what had happened. "I tried," I answered gently. "I asked questions. I raised concerns. But every time I did, someone else already had an explanation ready. Mark lowered his eyes. Across the table, Olivia remained silent. Lisa eventually spoke. Her voice sounded softer than I had ever heard it. She insisted that she believed she was helping. She said she wanted to reduce my stress. She explained that she thought simplifying things would make life easier for everyone. Perhaps part of that was true. Perhaps she even believed it herself. But intentions and outcomes are not always the same thing. I listened without interrupting. Then I nodded slowly. Maybe you started with good intentions, I said. But somewhere along the way, you stopped asking what I wanted. The room remained quiet. Nobody disagreed. David eventually gathered his folder and stood. Before leaving, he reminded everyone that the issue was never ownership of the accounts. The issue was transparency, communication, and control. Then he wished everyone well and quietly left. One by one, family members began gathering their belongings. The atmosphere felt completely different from when the meeting started. Earlier that afternoon, everyone had accepted a story about helping me. Now they were looking at the consequences of making decisions for me instead of with me. After the last guest departed, Mark walked me to my car. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the driveway. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me and quietly said the words I had been waiting to hear. "I am sorry, Mom." This time I believed him, not because of the words themselves, but because of the expression on his face. For the first time, he seemed willing to see what had actually happened. "I know you are," I replied softly. "What matters now is whether you understand why." He nodded. "I think I do." I studied him for a moment. This was never really about money. His expression shifted. "It was not." I shook my head. "No, money was simply the tool. The real issue was that people started making plans for my future without including me in the conversation." Mark looked away. The truth of that statement settled heavily between us. "Somewhere along the way," I continued, "you stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a problem that needed to be managed." He closed his eyes. Briefly, he did not argue because there was nothing to argue with. We both knew it was true. "Your father spent 44 years building a life with me," I said. "Every important decision we made together. Respect was always part of that partnership. That is what was missing here." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I reached for my car door. The thing Lisa could never take was the one thing that mattered most. Mark looked at me. "What was that?" I smiled gently. "My ability to decide who I am." As I drove home, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Peace. Not because I had won, not because anyone else had lost, but because I had finally reclaimed my voice. People often think trust is measured by access to accounts, paperwork, or financial information. It is not. Trust is measured by how carefully someone protects your voice when you are not in the room. Lisa thought she was gaining control of my future. What she never understood was that the one thing she could never control was my right to choose it for myself.